Welcome to season 2 of UnHypnotized, and we are back with our second episode in the theme of Bitcoin dating in a fiat world. We are going there, and we are going to keep going there for episodes and episodes. And I'm so excited for this conversation to happen today. It's someone that I've been wanting to have on the show and just can't wait to dive into this relevant topic of dating, and especially dating as a Bitcoiner. So welcome Sub Bunney to the show. Hello.
Oh man, I'm really excited. I think we just spoke just before this kind of podcast, and I mentioned that I really appreciate kind of the energy you bring to the space. And we've only met a couple times in person and chatted a couple times through social media. And yeah, I just really value just the energy you bring to the space, and I'm looking forward to chatting and seeing where this goes.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's been nice to interact at different events in Canada. I guess in that way, we're lucky to be part of the Canadian Bitcoin community.
Oh, I would say, like, as you're saying that, what really comes to mind is I feel so lucky to just be a part of the Bitcoin community where we are right now in Bitcoin. Because if you were to go to a finance conference, you're never going to be able to interact with the heavy hitters or the people that are really making waves and changing and like treading course for the financial industry. When it comes to Bitcoin, you can go to these small little events and you can be interacting with the Warren Buffetts of the crypto, or the not crypto, cut that out, Bitcoin world. And so I think that it's really profound time to be in the space because you're able to really talk with some incredible individuals that really are paving the way for the future.
That's a good point. It's at a time where it's still small enough that you get in the room with people that are making waves, making changes, like creating the space. Well, I mean, that does bring us to our topic, which is, dating and relationships, because as I've been posting more on X about this too, it comes to the surface a lot of times in this conversation of Bitcoin and dating that it's like 97% guys and 3% gals. And, something I have noticed at various conferences that, yeah, there's definitely a gap, or there's a large number of men compared to women. But I've also been seeing that as changing even over the past couple of years. And so I don't want to just focus the conversation on like this immense amount of men over women, because I also think that when we're talking about Bitcoin dating, we're also talking about values and desires and the type of relationships that we want to create, outside of like the fiat model. And I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on that.
I think it's really interesting that some of the points you bring up. And one that kind of comes to mind is that in today's world, I think because people are constantly pushed to the brink, we're kind of at our max when it comes to our kind of capacity to show up authentically in life. Women are working, men are working, and we're kind of really losing touch with ourselves. We don't have that time and space to be able to look inwards and get to know ourselves. How do we want to show up? What is it that I really value? Who am I? And what I think is so fascinating is that when it comes to Bitcoin, because Bitcoiners are starting to gain more capacity as their purchasing power increases, they can start to show up more authentically and ask themselves the questions about how they want to show up in life and what is important to them. And one thing that I really start noticing is that we are seeing a greater adoption of Bitcoin by women, and that's growing. And I think that is amazing. And if I was to put my finger on why that may be happening, I would say that we have shifted from Bitcoin being this technical subject where we're talking about code, we're talking about money, which many times can be quite masculine. And we're starting to talk about, well, how does money and things like Bitcoin impact how we show up as individuals? How does it impact our relationships? How does it impact the parent-child bond? How does it impact psychology? And those aspects, tons of my female friends really resonate with those aspects. And so the more we can bring Bitcoin and finance into the realm of relationships and community and showing up, I think we're going to see more women enter the space.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that was the impetus, the inspiration for Unhypnotized, bringing the holistic and the consciousness and the spirituality of Bitcoin into the conversation, or being able to have that conversation, because that's definitely my attraction. So much more than, like you said, those more masculine aspects of finance and money. Yeah. So I think, generally speaking, at this time where not just more women getting into Bitcoin, but I think more people recognizing that what worked before isn't working in many systems, in potentially all of the systems: healthcare, government, money, finance, and relationships. And I sometimes think that, the model of relationship, like, even though we could look at the family unit as being like really ideal in its best sense, I do think that it did have to fall apart in order to be rebuilt from like a more sacred ground. And I think that's also what's happening when we talk about Bitcoin dating. Like, people are waking up to this realization that they could be more intentional about the relationships that they can create. And when they're more authentic, they're likely to get involved in relationships that are better for them, right?
I couldn't agree more. And what comes to mind as you're saying that is this: most people that have kind of gone down the rabbit hole of psychology have probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's kind of this 5-tier little pyramid. And at the base, you have your basic survival needs. So you need food and shelter. And then you start getting into relationships. And then you go all the way up to like self-actualization and more spiritual needs. And when we are being pushed to our brink, to our maximum capacity, because prices are rising, cost of living is rising, we're having to work more, I feel like a lot of society is stuck just trying to meet their basic survival needs. So they're stuck trying to put a roof over their head, trying to put food on the table. And it's giving people less time to kind of move up that hierarchy and think about the relationships, their community, how they're showing up, their romantic life, things like that. And so what's really fascinating is this kind of connection, which kind of you've hinted at, between like money and relationships. When our money starts breaking down, when our purchasing power starts disintegrating, all of a sudden it starts to massively impact how we show up as individuals and our ability to direct energy and time towards our relationships and showing up more authentically, as I mentioned. And what I think is fascinating is that, like, where I live, which is the Sea to Sky Highway from Vancouver up to Whistler, the average house is something like $2 million. And so because of that, most of the millennial generation, they don't want kids. They're not even thinking about having kids. They're simply thinking about survival. And so we're starting to see, like, because of money, because of the cost of living, the demographics in society are changing. People aren't thinking about relationships. People aren't thinking about kids. People aren't thinking about their future. They're simply thinking about survival. And so what I think is so amazing about Bitcoin is that arguably for one of the first times in history, we have a way that over time, if our purchasing power is increasing, then we have more capacity. If our capacity is increasing, we have more time to look inwards. If we have more time to look inwards, we can start thinking more about, again, community, relationships, all of these things. And you just need to look into the world of Bitcoin and start to realize that Bitcoin is having more kids. Bitcoin is talking about relationships. Bitcoin is they're pumped on life. And it's amazing to see, because I haven't seen that throughout my life. Instead, I've just seen this degradation of relationships, as you're saying.
Yeah, like, as dark as that seems, when you say it, it's it is a reality that we're living in. Like, and then there's also been, I think, politics, in a sense, that has just been pushing that way of life to kind of make it seem more normal, like to just not have kids and to just have a 2-income household. And a couple of thoughts come to mind, but the first one that comes to mind for me is, like, do you think that that's created more of this like high time preference way of dating?
You know what? I would say 100%. I
Yeah.
would say that, like, to those that aren't familiar with this term, so
Yeah.
effectively, you've got the spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, you've got high time preference, which is people are focused on impulsive behavior and meeting their immediate needs. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got low time preference. People are thinking about the future. People are thinking about building security, prosperity, how they want to show up. And what's interesting is, again, when money starts breaking down, what we start to see is our cost of living starts to rise. Now, what that means is that our purchasing power is greatest in the present moment. It actually goes less far the further we get out into the future. So people are actually incentivized to be impulsive and spend right now. And we start to see that behavior not only in just our spending habits, but we start to see that behavior in dating. And so as we've seen this kind of degradation of money, we've also seen the arrival or the arrival of apps like Tinder and all of these various dating apps. Now on the surface, awesome. We can now meet people that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to meet. But the problem is it's being very impulsive. We're able to meet our needs immediately. If we can just swipe right and all of a sudden within 24 hours, we can be meeting someone. We know what their intention is. They want to date. We have an intention to date. And you're skipping all of these foundational steps to dating. And so I think what is really interesting about Bitcoin is when we have more capacity, all of a sudden we can start to, again, focus more on our intention and how we want to show up. We have more capacity to go and integrate into community, go to more events, meet people more naturally. And I think in doing so, we're feeling into the energy between two people rather than simply swiping right and meeting someone through one of these digital apps. And I think that that's something that we're losing in society. We're super disconnected. We're trying to be impulsive and we've lost that sense of what actually feels good in my body. Does this person jive with me energetically? Am I feeling in alignment with this person? And I feel like that's something we're losing. And I hear it I hear it amongst a lot of my friends as well.
Yeah, and I think that this hits me. This hits me because I can see how just over time I got used to that just being dating and somehow accepted it when it wasn't really in alignment with what I really wanted, but it felt like an in the meantime type of a thing that somehow I think like now when I think back on it, because as time went on, like the pattern just couldn't continue. And then the more of a Bitcoiner I became, the more like everything high time preference feels really unsatisfying. Like it did already. It's just now it's like I can't unsee it.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't convince myself of otherwise. Which has caused its own predicament in the sense of just having to be very patient and just very trusting in life to like bring me something that's more aligned because I'm not mixing up my energy with this like high time preference way of going about ultimately finding connection. And, you know, one of the things I think that did cause that, like I started thinking about it in the same way as, you know, debts become so normal. I think like high time preference dating has become so normalized because I also think that we're somewhat victims of the last 5 years where we were distanced from each other. And I think in our innate desire to like get back to each other and like connect and feel each other, it came with a certain anxiety. It came with a certain survival rather than like a thriving instinct. And I would love to just kind of, you know, jam back and forth a bit about that because I've been really thinking about like what the last 5 years has done to create more of a distance and this kind of debt and this way of doing things different. But I actually think it's coming from an innate desire for connection.
Mm-hmm. And you know what's really interesting? As you're saying that, what comes to mind is that if you hand a kid, like a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, an iPad, the amount of stimulus they're getting through that iPad all of a sudden makes day-to-day life almost a little bland because they're just getting massively oversensitized to this amount of stimulus that's coming in that the real world just cannot match. And I think that what these dating apps have done is it's like, how do we make dating as stimulating as possible? How do we meet people as quickly as possible? How do we get engagement and interaction as quickly as possible? And so it's almost kind of desensitized us to the normal relationship. And when you actually step back, it may feel great from that high time preference, thinking I'm being impulsive, I'm meeting these needs, it feels awesome, it feels good. But all of a sudden you realize there's no substance there. There's no deeper connection. There's no knowingness of this person in front of me. You're not building that long-term relationship, that foundation. And so although I would say that, yes, maybe that long-term relationship doesn't feel like super energetic and exciting all of the time, but that's not what you want. You want that stability, that groundedness that gives you the space to feel cared for and supported, and vice versa, to be able to care for and support the other person in front of you.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we talked about this a little bit too, like coming back to our intuition and our instincts instead of our impulses. One of the hardest realizations that I had for myself, like around dating, was like where I thought, not even actually around dating, just around life, business, everything, which is like just realizing where I was like, thought I was following my intuition, but it was really my impulse. And I'm not mad about it because I got to hear and like I don't think anything is right or wrong, but I think that the clarity or even the willingness to look at the clarification between following an impulse and following an instinct or an intuition is very different.
That's a really interesting point, and I'd never really thought about it in that way, where I think that today many of these impulses that we get are these societal constructs, these things that society is telling us we also should be doing. And so what comes to mind is that, like, we think about the masculine and feminine energy. And I think that, and this is a controversial subject, but I'm going to say it anyway, I think that feminism in many ways has done a huge disservice to the feminine energy, because in many ways it's just we want equality in society. But what does that equality mean? Well, we want women to work in men's jobs. We want women to be in these management jobs. And it's just like, if a woman wants to be in one of those jobs, I am fully supportive of that. But the reality is that a lot of women don't want to be managing a huge team or dealing with data and being in these very masculine jobs. And so I think that what's really interesting is that society has put a lot of pressure on women. So they've felt impulsive to be, I need the big high paying job. I need the management role. I need to be managing a huge team, you name it. And then when they've actually stepped back from that impulse and said, what is it that actually I want? A lot of the women around me have actually been like, actually, I want a family. And I feel a little bit of shame about that. And I shouldn't feel shame about that. And so what I think is so cool about Bitcoin, as I mentioned, is that we're starting to recognize that there is a difference in the masculine and feminine energy. And I'm all for women leaning into their masculine energy, 100%. But not all women necessarily want to do that. And if a woman wants to raise kids or build a family and build community, that is amazing. And they should never feel shame around that. And that's leaning into, as you mentioned, that intuition, that feeling, as opposed to being impulsive or listening to these societal pressures that we're feeling.
Exactly. So I was born in the 70s. What era were you born in?
But a little later than that. The 90s.
90s?
Yeah, early 90s.
So, I mean, I was late 70s, but still, I was curious, but I thought I already knew. And it's interesting because like I just fell into that. I was definitely a victim of that thinking like that, and especially being such a creative person. I really fell into this idea of, oh, we can do anything. We're women. We can do anything. And lots of times we can even do it better than men can. And just and then seeing that and then having myself been having a family, being married, and then having friends in the same situations where not where we were being empowered by that, but then like the men in our lives were being disempowered by that. And so then as like we were kind of in this like, oh, we can do anything we want, but like at the detriment of a lot of our adrenal systems and like hormones and like kind of intuition in a sense too, we were also becoming less attracted to the men in that same space because the men were like really being disempowered to like be in those more masculine type of roles as we were being empowered. And then in my generation, it was just a lot of divorce. It was a lot of divorce because like at some point, one, we just can't do it all. And that's exhausting. And two, we're not attracted to the men anymore because we've essentially almost emasculated them in our like plight for empowerment. And so I think that this is obviously there's obviously nuances to this conversation, but I love to think about especially like relationships and love and like sexuality in a very masculine, feminine way because I do feel like the feminine truly is like the most free to be herself, like in a masculine container. And I think part of that, because, we've, as women also, we can go out and just get what we want. Like, we don't have to really let it come to us. But I also think that that's part of this problem somehow.
Is the thing that's also just so challenging is that, so I was working in the school district for a while, and kind of to the point which you're making, this one classroom I was working in, we did this activity one morning that the teacher hosted, and she drew this line on the floor. And then she went around the classroom. There's probably 30 kids in the classroom. She handed out job roles. And so these job roles were like nurse or finance manager or whatever, firefighter. And then on the spectrum from male to female, the person had to place, who do you tend to think of when you think of this role? Like, do you think of the male or do you think of the female? Or is it mixed? And what really kind of stood out is that the kids had gone around the circle and placed a lot of these more like masculine roles, obviously on the male side, and these feminine roles. But the teacher then said, well, this is why we need equality. All jobs should be in the middle. And I'm standing there, I'm just like, man, these kids are like 10 years old. Yeah. And they're being told that every single man and woman should be treated exactly the same. And a job should not be like focused on maybe gender. Now, although I wholeheartedly agree that there'll be men that are more feminine and there'll be women that are more masculine, and I fully support that, there's a reason why in more emotionally caring roles, there are way more women. And there's a reason why in more management data-driven roles, there are more men. And I think that sometimes, to your point, like it's really easy to ignore the nuance or try and break down these gender roles in society, when in reality, I think that if we break down gender roles, it's going to have huge repercussions on the relationships. And it already is having huge repercussions because we need polarity in relationships. There has to be the masculine and the feminine energy. And even when you look in relationship between two men or relationship between two women, there still tends to be the masculine and the feminine energy because you need that polarity in order to find that collaboration, that love, and that spice.
Yeah. This is just such a relevant topic of our time. And, as we're going through the world, like I felt a gratitude. I feel a gratitude for being able to like bring in my own income because it's also given me the grace of not having to choose a high time preference relationship. But I have been many a time where I just was like exhausted, overwhelmed, like just not wanting to do it on my own. And my first thought is to just like, I could literally go get a man right now and that will take care of my bills. Like I know a couple. And it's come up over the years. And like in my lowest moments, I have considered it. I really have. And because I just like, I don't feel like it's natural. It's like, it doesn't feel natural for me to be in the role. But then when we bring in, the soul and the soul's purpose and even sovereignty, I think this is where sovereignty really comes into the conversation. Like, I love how your site is called, what is it? Chi of Sovereignty?
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, everyone check out his site. It's so great. There's so many articles and videos on there. Is that like subbunny.com?
Yep.
Yeah, it's really great. And I love just that aspect of the energy of sovereignty. And I think when we're talking about dating and relationships, sovereignty does come into this. And I think that's also maybe why Bitcoiners can struggle with dating or like finding matches that seem aligned. What do you think about that?
I think, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that what comes to mind as you're saying that is this idea that what Bitcoin does is it gives us back sovereignty over our life and our trajectory. And the challenge we face today is because we're being financially kind of pressured constantly, many times we're making decisions through fear of what the future holds, whether I'm going to put food on the table, roof over my head. And so we're making decisions purely based on the monetary information we've got available to us and not based upon what is it that actually I want to do right now? What do I feel drawn towards right now? And so I think from the masculine side of things, men are going out and working to survive. And from the feminine side of things, women are trying to make decisions on, okay, how do I survive and support myself? Whereas I think that when we have more financial capacity, we can lean in, does this relationship actually work for me? Is this someone who I actually want to be with? Not because they're bringing in an income which supports me. And so I think Bitcoin is unique in that it gives both the male and the female of a relationship the capacity to show up more authentically. And the challenge, again, like where I live in the Sea to Sky Highway, because of the cost of living is just like so insane, what we're finding is a lot of people, they jump into a relationship and then a month later, they're just like, you know what? We can't afford rent separately. Let's just move in together.
Yeah.
So because of the financial pressures, people are fast tracking these foundational important moments in relationships where you're building connection, you're getting to know one another, and you're figuring out how you guys jive and work together. And I think that if we fast track those, it can be detrimental down the line. And so it's just like when we have more financial capacity to show up, we're able to take it slower. We're able to listen more to our gut and to our intuition and make decisions based upon what feels good as opposed to what is a necessity because of the financial conditions.
It's like fiat dating is like survival. It's like fiat dating is survival. Bitcoin dating is more thriving. Like it's more, or what would it be like? If fiat dating is survival, what is Bitcoin dating?
Oh man, I feel like it's thriving. It's just like I am going to do whatever I can, as opposed to I'm going to do whatever feels good for me. You know what I mean? And I think that is such a big distinction. And it's kind of like if I was to compare it to like another aspect of the difference between like fiat and Bitcoin, it's that in the fiat world, because we're constantly being pressured monetarily, we're having to work more. Because we're working more, we have less time to think about the information we're consuming. And so I see that so many of my friends, so many people around me, they don't really have a grasp on what's happening in the world because they're simply just taking things at face value. They're not critically thinking about the information they're consuming. Whereas Bitcoiners, it's the other way around. Bitcoiners, because they have more time as time goes by, they're thinking way more consciously about the information they're consuming and they're making way more informed decisions. And that's just day to day. And so when you start taking that into the relationship realm, you're no longer just responding to those impulsive needs and the information that's being presented to you on dating apps. You're making thoughtful, aware decisions.
Yeah, that's exactly the way I see it. You know, when I think about psychology and just all of the different dynamics I've seen in the mind in hypnotherapy, it's always been that. Like if somebody is coming from like a survival place and making that decision, that can feel like intuition, but I think that's more impulse. And it is like kind of an innate, like it still is an innate feeling like I've got to survive. Like, and it definitely can come from a place of fear. And, you know, I always like saw that as something of like, you know, for us all to work towards. And then coming into the Bitcoin realm is like, oh, wait, this is like actually a whole mindset where, yeah, we still might sometimes feel that fear that, especially it's just being fed to us like constantly, you know, like everywhere. So we might still feel that fear, but if we can step back and like be okay with the discomfort, because I think, and I obviously we're like generalizing Bitcoiners because trust me, I saw a lot of triggered, I heard a lot of triggered, closed-minded Bitcoiners in spaces. So, you know, I just want everybody who's like not a Bitcoiner or even a Bitcoiner that's listening, like we are definitely not saying like every Bitcoiner is this self-aware or open-minded, but we are saying generally speaking, especially if they've gone through the bear and the bull markets and they've hodled, you know, all this way through, generally speaking, they're better at feeling the discomfort and you know, waiting out like the high time preference for the low time preference. So I will just say that, you know, we know that this is not everyone.
It's what I find is interesting about that point is that I've stumbled upon and noticed that there's Bitcoin has gone deep down the rabbit hole. The ones that are questioning, the ones that I feel are trying to show up as authentically as possible and think about the information they're consuming. And I think that is absolutely amazing. But then at the same time, I also think there is a specific type of Bitcoiner, and this is a byproduct of our current world, whereby because they've never really found community and they're having to work and their time is just consumed with trying to survive, what's interesting is the moment you go start and you say some of these Bitcoin phrases like stack sats and, well, what is it? Stay humble, stack sat,
Yeah, most
and 21 million and all of this stuff. The moment you say this, all of a sudden you have a whole community. And so these people, they realize for the first time in their life, I feel connection with people. And it's not that they've gone deep down the rabbit hole. They're actually coming out. And if you question anything that relates to the community, they start attacking you. And they're attacking you not because they understand Bitcoin, it's because you're now threatening the only community they've ever had. And so this is, again, a byproduct of the fiat world. When we can't find community because we're having to work, people latch on to the first time they find that sense of community. And so that's the kind of the two sides to Bitcoin, I find.
Yeah, that's interesting because like we're all human, right? And we all have our path to take. And we were talking a bit earlier, before we started filming about surrender and how, a lot of times people like, let's be real, like people want a relationship and they might not admit it. Like, that's why I wanted to open up my space for this conversation because I get it. Like, I'm not going to be on X being like, okay, so yesterday when I was dating, or, it's like, it's something that like not everyone is just going to put out there. Right. But people want it. It's a goal that people have, and I like, talking about goals and thinking about like how we really accomplish something and where surrender comes into that.
Yeah, I would have said that, like, I wish when actually we spoke about it very quickly, which is I wish we'd recorded before we actually started recording because we had such an awesome conversation. And to that point, what came up was this idea that I think the world at which we live in today, because we're constantly being pressured, we're very much like stuck in our cognitive heads. We're less in the body and way more in the thought process. And one of the byproducts of that is that we're very focused on efficiency. We're very focused on goal settings. We're like, I want this, I want this, I want this. You start to see all of these narratives around like SMART goals. Goals should be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, timely. And it's just the reality from my perspective is that the moment we start getting super cognitive about our trajectory, okay, I want a relationship and I want 2 kids and I want a 3-bedroom house in this location, all of a sudden we start to box ourselves in. And the more we box ourselves in, we're putting blinders and we're not actually seeing the information of which the world is giving us. Now, I very much believe, and I think we're kind of somewhat in alignment, that the world is always giving us information to grow. But we can choose to receive that information or we can ignore that information. And when we start setting goals, we end up pigeonholing our trajectory and we kind of prevent that information from coming in. We've got those blinders up. And so I think what's fascinating again about kind of like Bitcoin is that as we start to have more capacity to look inwards, I find we start disconnecting a little bit from this constant efficiency, constant goal setting, and we start going a little more of the flow and listening to what feels good. And for me personally, I've noticed that when I stop goal setting and actually I allow life to kind of like unravel as it should, it's profound the amount of information that comes up. And maybe I'll share like one quick story.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
I was in like a pretty challenging relationship. We'd been together for about 2 years. And to me, on paper, this person was amazing. We aligned on so many different levels. We had the same political outlook. She was down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I was just like, this person is amazing. But being 100% honest with myself, from the moment I met her, I did not feel that energetic connection. And I tried to override that energetic connection because of all of the tick boxes on paper. And one day I was driving down to get my car fixed in the city. And as I'm driving down and getting my car fixed, I was just like, oh man, like, is this the relationship I want? Like, I feel very disconnected and I feel like I'm making the wrong decision. And I don't feel energetically drawn to this person. Anyway, I get down to the city, I get down to the garage, and the garage is like, oh, the car's going to take an extra like 4 hours. You just got to bide your time. So I was like, okay, I'll go for a walk. And I'm walking down the streets of Vancouver and my shoelace is undone. And I look down and I'm like, oh, okay, got to fix shoelace. Bend over and out the corner of my eye, I see a book on a garbage can flap open. And I was like, what is that book? And I walk over to the book and it's a book called, it's like The Shamanistic Guide to Inner Healing. And on the page that it is open, it is on my birthday, and it says, your lesson in this life is to listen to your inner knowing. And I'm just like, what? Like, this is profound. And so I tend to think that when we actually step back, when we get out of our heads and when we're purely present, the world is giving us information. That's a very specific piece of information that is a huge red, like flag being like, hey, listen here. But I feel like every single day, at every single moment, there's all these little subtle pieces of information that's being handed to us. And when we have more capacity, we have more capability to see these little flags that are popping up and giving us cues as to the trajectory.
I mean, now you're talking my language. Yes. It's so funny being a hypnotist for so long. People always come to me with their goals, you know? And at first, I was very much like NLP, like you're saying, you know? What's the suggestion that the subconscious will accept and execute? And like, it was very much like that because that was the world that I lived in and I trained in. But it wasn't very long into it where I realized like this is just so surface level accomplishment. And then I started to notice more and more people accomplishing their goals and like not even being happy about it, not even really feeling joy. And what I started to realize was that, yeah, part of the like the rewiring that people were actually looking for was to come away from kind of what they thought they needed to do in order to achieve something or attract something. And so I love thinking about like intention. And I think intention over goal setting is just like a million times better, or like 21 million times better. But at the same time, that's the key. When we let life give us those cues. I love your example because I feel like that's a really practical example that somebody could understand the point that we're making. And I also think that that happens in our relationships because a lot of people will still hold on to negativity from the past relationships. And I think, and like, it's easy to be even hard on ourselves or critical of ourselves. Like, what was I thinking? Or like, or why didn't that person want me? Whatever it is. I think it's like really easy to hold on to stuff from past relationships, but I also think that that affects our ability to like open our hearts and like be in relationship when new people come into our lives in a less, in a slower, more organic way. And so what I found was that, as we let the relationships that we've had, the people that have come into our lives, the people that are potentially in your life right now, be also part of God, part of life, part of the energy of life that is giving us guidance. A lot of times, those people that may not be right for us are going to still bring up stuff in ourselves that will give us either healing, something that's ripe for release or change, or even just like an awareness about something that we can see in order to like become more aligned with what we want.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? You just said it perfectly. And I think that one thing that I find really interesting is that when I started going down this path, I felt very resistant to allowing life to just unfold. I felt I was just like, oh man, how can I kind of like let go of the reins and just let life unfold? Like I need to plan. I need to put goals in place. And I know that like Buddhist kind of philosophy is this idea of like non-attachment. And I'm standing there, I'm like, but isn't life just bland if you have non-attachment? You just detach from everything. Isn't life just bland? And what really hit me one day as I was reading this book called Conversations with God. And it's fascinating for those that aren't familiar. Basically, this book is this guy. He said he was frustrated one day, so he decided to write God a letter. And as he wrote God a letter, God started responding to his questions. Now, I'm not religious, but I found the teachings in this book to be profound. And one of the teachings in this book, this one little paragraph, and I'll quickly read it. One of my favorite, like top 3 quotes is the renunciate, meaning the person who renunciates some form of gives up on something. The renunciate never denies passion. The renunciate simply denies attachment to results. Passion is the love of doing. Doing is being experienced. Yet what is often created as a part of doing is expectation. To live your life without expectation, without the need for specific results, that is freedom. That is godliness. And to me, like the way I interpret this kind of paragraph is that we can lean into things with passion, but the key is just to separate the expectation of results. When you lean into a relationship, the first day you meet someone, you shouldn't be thinking, okay, I want to have 3 kids with this person. What's going to happen in a year? Okay, we've got to figure out how to move in together. It's let's just let this thing unfold and see where it goes. And it will go where it's meant to go.
Oh, yes. My favorite things, passion and allowing, the art of allowing. I love Abraham Hicks. I saw Esther live a couple times. Like, I love Abraham Hicks. And she always says, or they say, they think that the new marriage vow should be, I like you just fine right now. Let's see where this goes. Or we could say, I love you now. Let's see where this goes. And it's not saying that we're not committing. It's just saying like we're committing to showing up every day in the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
We're committing to like spend time together in the present moment as we go along and allow ourselves to grow together. And I think sometimes there is a sense of non-attachment that is required in a more mature relationship, because fact of the matter is we're going to lose that person one day no matter what. Even if it's like till death do us part, like we are eventually going to separate from that person. And I do think that, which I never intended to get into today, but since we're going here and you are obviously capable of having a very deep conversation, I think, the fear of death does tend to cause a high time preference. And I think it's something that's not talked about. And I think it does affect relationships and so many choices that people make without them realizing it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, and this is such a fascinating subject. And I think what's really interesting is like, you just need to look at the difference between like Eastern versus kind of Western approach to death. And in the Eastern approach to death, you notice that like there are families that live with multiple generations, and typically because they don't have access to the medical care that we have access to in the Western world, when people start to get like a terminal illness, they move on pretty quickly. Like 1 month, 2 months is not much suffering. And because of this, we put a lot of these elders in high regard. There's so much wisdom at which they can pass down. Whereas what we see in the Western world is we do not care about quality of life. We care about quantity. How do we extend someone's life from 65 years to 85 to 95, even though the last 20 years they could barely walk, they were hobbling along, they weren't there mentally. And so we start to see these people suffering and suffering and suffering. And so in the Western world, we have such a fear of death because we've seen this painful thing that is drawn out over such a long period of time, while people are supported by life support systems and drugs. And I think that we've become so scared of death, we've detached from our relationships with elders and the knowledge at which they can pass on. And that fear of death is almost like this fear of abandonment, which we're starting to see in all of our relationships. That fear of abandonment is showing up all of the time. And so we see codependent relationships across all of society. People are reliant on their partners. And I think it's really important to separate the difference between a codependent relationship and an interdependent relationship. And so if you're reliant on your partner, if you can't survive without your partner, if you can't even imagine what life is like without your partner, then there is an unhealthy there's an unhealthy dependence on your partner. An interdependent relationship is one where, hey, I can rely on my partner and I know my partner has got my back and is there to support me, but there will also be times when they can't, and they just need to be honest about that, and that's also totally okay. And that's a healthy form of dependence. And I think that we as a society, because of our abandonment wounds, our relationships with death, we have a fear of our partner leaving us. And so we stay in these relationships much longer than many of them need to be through that fear of abandonment.
Ooh, that's some juicy gossip there. That's not really gossip, but that's just some juiciness, right? Like this is diving into the depths, which is always my desire. And, as we kind of we're not going to close it yet, but as we get closing this, I have a couple questions. One, what's your sign?
I'm an Aquarian.
You're an Aquarius. And do you know what your North Node is?
I have, you know what? There's this guy that his name's Gary. He lives in like kind of the plains of Canada.
Oh, I know Gary. I have had many readings by Gary.
Really?
Yes.
He is profound.
Awesome.
So this guy, I've probably spent maybe 4 or 5 hours total with this guy over like 3 or 4 calls. And he obviously, you give him your birth date, you give him the time of your birth, the location of your birth, and then he reads your chart. And to me, I was just, the first time this took place, I was just absolutely in awe. It was as if someone had just read my autobiography. Like, I was just like, what is happening? This guy knows all of the key events in my life. And so far, like, this was the last time I saw him was about 2 years ago. And he accurately portrayed some of the events that were going to take place over the last 2 years. And so, although I don't know my chart intimately, and I have a book next to my bed that goes into all of the various houses and whatnot, I can't tell you what my North Node is right now.
That's a tough one. I mean, most people can't. Do you know your moon sign?
It's an area that I find so fascinating, and I should spend more time.
I mean, if you want, I'll send you a whole thing on your chart.
Love that.
And North Node is so fun because it's like the soul's purpose. But more exciting is that Gary. I'm gonna message him after this. I'm gonna be like, guess what? Because like he's actually from Saskatchewan, like where I'm from. And I think he was my first astrologer too that just like blew me away and probably got me into astrology. Because as you know, you can just like sit down with him and it's a conversation that I do always like to plant a few seeds with Bitcoiners because it's definitely leading up to like an episode or more, around astrology. And I've loved like breaking down the astrology of Bitcoin. And it's not that I think of astrology like, oh, you're this and you're a perfect match for this, or because you're Aquarius, you're like this. Like, I don't like using it as a tool for like putting people in a box or putting people in some type of a pattern. But what I love about astrology is like, I like more evolutionary astrology. So it's just like basically like a map of your like of the sky when you were born, but it's also like it offers that potential to be like, what are like the complex themes of your life or the complex theme of your life? And I found like, the way that Bitcoin can really like bring out stuff in you that's, I don't know. I saw something the other day. This isn't totally the point that I'm making, but I saw something where someone said like, if Bitcoin isn't leading you to God, I hope you lose it all. Okay. I don't know who said it, and I get it out of my head because I would never hope for anyone to lose all their Bitcoin, and I know everyone's definition is different of God, but it's like actually the way I see it, like Bitcoin really like kind of forces you to like wake up and like really face your fears, like face your fears, face your issues, face your setbacks.
Well, now to come on that note, I was just going to make that is like fiat money today. We're just so hyper focused on money, like because we're constantly trying to attain it, because life is getting harder and we've got rising bills. Our focus is constantly on, okay, where do I get money? Where's my next paycheck coming from? I got to work. What I think is so cool about Bitcoin, and the irony of Bitcoin, is that although it is money, it gets us to stop thinking about money. And I think that as our purchasing power increases, we have more capacity to show up authentically, as we've mentioned many times throughout this. And I think that that gives us way more capability to ground and kind of pursue more of our spiritual purpose. And so there's a whole bunch of podcasts and books that discuss this idea, the Bitcoin and consciousness, Bitcoin and spirituality. And I truly believe that Bitcoin is a spiritual tool. Is a tool for grounding, and it's a tool for allowing humanity to start to lean in to what each and every one of our purposes is. And I think that is so amazing. And that's something that the average person, when they come into Bitcoin for the gains, that is awesome. But in time, I'm hoping you'll start to recognize that this is far more than just this thing that appreciates in price. It is a way to ground us and help us find our own spiritual purpose.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way I think of astrology in that sense too. Like a way that we can become more aware of like the greater things that we came here to experience and do. And I do think that people come into that. I mean, I think probably I can't finish this conversation without asking you, for all the people out there. So are you dating as a Bitcoiner right now?
You know what? So I was dating as a Bitcoiner. And I think we spoke about this on a call the other day, and I had this weird dating experience where I decided, I was like, you know what? I'm a Bitcoiner. I work in my basement suite of my house. I have a pretty tight-knit friend group, and I would call myself an extroverted introvert. I big social environments, not the biggest fan of. I like to have like host dinner with a few close friends and have awesome conversation. And that's like my love language. And so what I found is I'm just like, how am I going to meet people? This is challenging. And so what did I do? I lent into the impulsive apps and I was like, I'm going to try these apps out. And what's interesting is I went on a few dates and maybe two or three over a handful of months, 3 or 4 months. And none of them really stood out to me. And so I respectfully, after the first date, just said, hey, I really value like the conversation. I really enjoyed kind of going for a walk, but I want to be honest, and I'm not really feeling it. And so anyway, I ended up matching with this other lady, and this lady ended up sending me a message after a few messages back and forth. And she says something along the lines of just like, I hope this isn't you. And I want to know more about what these people are saying about you. And I was just like, what is she talking about? So it turns out that there are these groups called Are We Dating the Same Guy? And these groups are women-only groups on Facebook where women go on there to post up pictures of men to ask their opinions or like if they've had any bad experiences. And what's interesting is my profile had been posted by someone on this group. And I have never cheated on anyone. I have never been like abusive. I don't think I've ever done any like intentionally toxic behavior. And so I've been posted on this group, and all of a sudden there was a whole bunch of comments under the group, but saying things just like, oh yeah, he's a love bomber. He goes on a date and then he ends the date. He does this, he does that. And I'm standing there, I'm just like, one, everyone was anonymous, so you don't actually know, there's no accountability. Two, what you start to realize is that because everyone's anonymous, you're not able to separate truth from fiction. And many times people, they're stuck in their ego. And so when they're rejected by someone, even if it's just a single date and they're rejected, they project their own issues out into the world. Well, actually, no, that guy wasn't right for me and he's creepy, he's this, he's that. And so all of a sudden I was posted on this forum and I was commented about, which I think were quite unfair comments. So I ended up just kind of posting this long form article on my blog, subbunny.com. You can read it if you want, just sharing my experiences. And what it really made me realize after this whole experience is that our society is so disconnected. And because we have so little capacity to think about the information we're consuming, we're passing off decision-making onto someone else. We're chatting with someone for 2 minutes, and then we're posting their profile picture and who they are on these groups, and we're passing off our decision-making about whether we should date someone onto a community of other people that many times are in a fight, flight, freeze response. They're in their own trauma body, and they're not making effective decisions. And so I very much urge people to make decisions from your intuition. Listen to what it is you're feeling as opposed to passing that information off onto other people. And the challenge is, these groups, I can totally understand there may be a purpose if someone has been like physically abusive or there has been illegal activity, that someone's been raped, sexually abused, you name it. 100% I can see a purpose for women warning other women. I see that as empowering. But at what point is gossiping about someone else actually being the behavior you're trying to remove? And I think that's what we're facing with a lot of these dating apps. And so anyway, to the question, I was just like, I'm done with these dating apps. I do not need this. And this is, again, I think the world giving me what it is that I needed to grow. I deleted the dating apps, and then I met someone the next week in person. And we've been dating for a few months. And so I think it was really, really interesting. I think that was part of my journey, is recognizing that these dating apps are not my trajectory. These dating apps are just helping me to raise awareness, to listening to intuition and meeting people naturally.
Yeah, 100%. And I also think that you being you, that you are in the space, having a lot of conversations with people, that I think that experience is good for you, even to be able to reflect on and have this conversation, which does not pass me. Yeah, it was really interesting when you posted that. It was so timely because I had just joined one of those groups not that long ago, because one of my clients did have a legitimate abusive relationship, and then other people were saying, oh, more women are telling the same story. And like you said, something illegal, something really harmful. It's one thing to warn each other, but then also what I learned from spending time in there was exactly that. It's like people were like, these women are outsourcing their intuition. And it's so many times they would just start talking to someone and then go, hey, tell me about this guy. And so instead of being able to use, I don't want to say use, but like utilize dating and relationship as a way to learn to trust ourselves more, as a way to learn to trust our intuition, because experience is the way. Like if I said to someone, okay, you know what, I'll do a 2-day workshop. I'll teach you how to trust your intuition. It's like $500. Come, I'll teach you how to trust your intuition. And you say, I don't know, go to the mechanic, and the mechanic's like, oh, it's like going to be $500 for everything that you need. And in your intuition is like, nah, I don't think so. I should probably go somewhere else, but you pay the $500. Lesson learned, same thing. You learn the same lesson for your intuition. And I really believe relationships does help us develop a better relationship with ourselves, and dating can help us trust each other, especially if we can get past the ego hurt of feeling rejected and go, no, I knew that. Like I knew in myself it wasn't right for me, even though I'm hurt that life took this person out of my life. I'm still hurt. And I think that is all normal part of relationships. But then when we outsource our intuition and we're looking for feedback based on someone else's very personal experience of their own triggers, of their own ego, of their own hurts, then it's not like how many people are probably not giving love a chance as a result of that. And that's like exactly what I saw when I went into that world too. And, I think it does really bring us back to what I also love about the Bitcoin community is that, we are at a time where inner authority is gaining more momentum. Like there's a real value being put into inner authority over outer authority. And because of the pain and the suffering that's been caused by what happens when we listen and do something for ourselves or our health or our wealth that then isn't right for us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it very much mimics the structure of Bitcoin. Like, why was Bitcoin founded? Because we put all of our decision making, all of our power, and we rely so much on trust on these central authorities, these middlemen, and we're just taking back that power. We're being more self-sovereign, and we're, rather than putting trust in any central authority, we're finding that consensus by putting ourselves out there and making decisions off our own back. And so I find that so interesting. And like even kind of going back to that dating point for a second, what I find is really interesting about these groups is this idea that it's meant to be built as a way to empower women. And I think that when you're dealing with legitimately illegal behavior, physical abuse, sexual abuse, fully agree. Empowering. How do we want each other and support one another? But the problem is, it's just like at what point as well is it that you're sharing all this information, you're not actually making a decision on your own. That's disempowering. If you can't make that decision on your own, that's not empowering. That's disempowering. And the other thing is, if women are able to post anonymously, the challenge is you can't verify truth from fiction. And so you end up getting in this section where women who have their own attachment issues, they feel abandonment, and they can all of a sudden find a sense of security, community, even though that community is built on negativity. All of a sudden they're leaning into this like, hey, the more I post about these people, the more people are responding. This responding feels good. I'm getting notifications on my phone. People are interested in me. And we're creating this false sense of security grounded in these negative foundations. And so it's just like, how do we actually just step back and listen to what our gut is saying? Because the thing that I find really interesting is sometimes we find, hey, there's a pattern in our relationships. I've been in 4 or 5 relationships where there's been this take place. And it's just like, maybe we should step back and ask, well, maybe the world is trying to give us a message. Maybe it's not actually with the other person, it's with us. And that's what I find is so interesting. In these groups, we're passing off decision-making onto others. How do we pass that back and put it back on ourselves, listen to our intuition, learn from these relationships and grow? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I have a lot of compassion for people, for humans in general, because I know even with like my awareness, my age, my experience, I still it's still so hard to not take it personally sometimes. I have like so much compassion for, when people react from that place. But Where I don't have really acceptance for is like when they're projecting it onto somebody else. Because it's one thing to realize in your own self, like you're projecting like your stuff onto someone else, and that's hurtful. But it's another thing to like really actively continue doing it in public. And I think it's like that type of behavior. Like again, this like not taking responsibility for ourselves and like our own triggers and our own stuff that's coming up is also what causes like this constant what I think is like a pretty constant I don't know what we would call it, but where people are afraid to be themselves. You know, where people are afraid to just authentically show up as themselves, say how they feel, be themselves, because it's so often that someone can just be bothered by that and then throw it back at you and then make it seem like you caused them to feel this pain, not you specifically, but you in the general sense. And I guess as we, start to as we wrap this up, like I always like to come to maybe some form of solution. I like to come to like, it's not all dark, you guys, like there's hope. And I mean, Bitcoin is hope. And I really do think that Bitcoiners and dating, like there is hope for us because we are really aligned with like an integrity and a willingness to like show up and like be responsible for ourselves. So I guess my last question would be like, yeah, how would you like, is there a way that we can just keep being authentic and keep showing up in the midst of all this?
So I'm gonna break that in kind of two parts. The first is in psychology. This really stood out to me when I kind of went down this rabbit hole, and it's this idea of our locus of control. And I'll explain it for a second. So you've basically got, again, a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, you've got an internal locus of control, which is I believe I have control over my trajectory. I have control over what it is that I do and how I experience the world. And then on the other end, you've got an external locus of control, which is I don't have control over my trajectory. Kind of the world dictates what happens. And what's really interesting is that when you have an external locus of control, you have much worse health outcomes. You have much higher rates of depression, anxiety, you name it. Like it's profound, the effect of not feeling like we're in control. And then vice versa. When you've got an internal locus of control, when I believe I control my destiny, I control my trajectory, all of a sudden we have much greater health outcomes. We live longer. We have lower rates of depression, anxiety, even things like ADHD. And so as I'm like kind of trending through life, what I'm really trying to be aware of is this idea of where is my mindset right now? Do I notice whether or not I have control over a bit of my trajectory, or am I kind of like giving up in this area of life? And I recently kind of stumbled upon this book called The Inside Out Revolution. And it put it...
No, you didn't.
Have you read this book as well?
Oh, Michael Neal is my coach.
Really?
As you were talking, I was like, man, he's like talking three principles language. Oh no, gosh, Katie's gonna die. Like, oh my gosh. Like, we can't even with us. That's how Katie and I met through a Michael Neal group where we were
near way
older synchronistically to like coach each other.
Yeah. That's profound. Oh, the world always gives you what you need. Like, absolutely.
Well, I'm gonna let you please talk about the Inside Out Revolution.
So there's something that's really interesting about this book, which is I've heard these ideas said in various ways. Buddhist scriptures kind of repeated these ideas, but never in a way that really just hit me in such a simplistic like approach. And basically what he talks about is that our perception of the world is not based upon the experiences at which we have. Mm-hmm. Our perception of the world is actually our experiences towards our thoughts. And so when we have these experiences, we have thoughts relating to those experiences, and our perception of the world is based upon those thoughts, not the external experiences. And so if you want to change your experience of the world, you just have to change your thought. And so I think that the difference between someone with an internal locus of control and an external locus of control is very much the thoughts that are attached to what's going on in the external world. And the analogy that kind of comes to mind is like if you're walking down the street and you're kind of looking at something, and all of a sudden someone walks quite hard into your shoulder, you may become dysregulated and start to feel frustrated. Oi, like, why'd you walk into my shoulder? But if as you turn around, you realize that person is blind, then all of a sudden that shifts from frustration and anger to compassion. And we're going to be like, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't see you there. And so what that highlights is the event has not changed. The external event of walking into this person has not changed, but our feelings of anger and frustration and shifting towards compassion and support changed simply because we changed our thought. And so I think that I've become way, way, way more aware of my thoughts associated with the experiences I have in the world around me. And that has made such a big difference. And I'm curious to hear like your thoughts on this approach and anything you want to share.
This is so perfect. And this is the episode, like Katie and I are filming after this episode, and we're going to get even more into the 3 principles. So anybody, watching, even though we don't always say it, so the 3 principles of thought, mind, and consciousness, which is really just like a framework for helping you understand how you're experiencing your reality and, how you experience your thinking. And, when we're experiencing our thinking and how much that can change what we think is our reality. Like you said, like at first it's like, oh my God, this person's so rude. And then you realize, oh, this person didn't do this at all intentionally. And, that changed my whole practice. Like, Michael Neal and the Pranskys, like the relationship handbook is like a beautiful book written about the 3 principles as well. And then I've been on like lots of calls with lots of 3P coaching, and that's actually the coaching that I do. So that changed like my whole work, even as a hypnotist. Like I actually wrote a chapter and a book for practitioners about like how to bring these principles into your work, and it makes it more sovereign. And because the whole thing is like when we really realize that everybody has innate well-being in them, everybody has innate wisdom, then we stop being like so hard on ourselves and so hard on each other and think more about like nurturing, the innate beauty, the innate health, the innate wisdom that is within us all, and holding space for that rather than trying to change people because they're making us feel some type of way, or even actually trying to change the world. Like, look at all the stress that people have, like with the things in the world that they can't control. And even as I've been working with clients this week, like a lot of the work I've been doing recently is just helping them get more grounded in their knowing and in themselves, and realize how like they're experiencing their thinking about the world, and that's causing them distress. And I love how I've never heard it compared to like the locus of control. And I think that's so invaluable because the message is really that like inner, sovereignty starts from within.
Mm-hmm.
And that can seem so vague, but when we can help people realize that like they're experiencing their thinking and that may not actually be the reality, then I think people are less down about the future. They're less down about what's possible in their lives. They're more open to see those, like Michael Neal, he'll call it like providence helping you create the impossible. And there's just a world of fresh and new to be experienced in all areas of life.
Mm-hmm. And as you're saying that, I remember years ago, I stumbled upon this kind of, I don't think it's a quote exactly, but it was something along the lines of brilliance isn't created, it's destroyed. Like in all of us, from the moment we're born, and it kind of is in alignment with what you're saying, which is like, we have this innate wellness. And I think we also have this innate brilliance in all of us. And it's just that our conditioning and our upbringing and all of these things end up filtering a lot of that. And so we lose that idea, we lose that realization that actually we have this in brilliance. We have this capacity to kind of connect on a deeper spiritual level. And so what I love about this idea is it's just like when you start stepping back and really recognizing that it's not what happens out there, it's what happens in here that dictates your trajectory, life changes for the better immensely. And for me, I don't know if I would have stumbled upon this if it wasn't for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is what gave me the capacity to also stumble down a lot of these rabbit holes.
It's like so cool because three principles like was the pathway to Bitcoin for me because it just cracked open everything I knew, especially about healing and psychology and, coming away from what I think of as kind of also fiat models of healing of the mind. And then coming into, really understanding like how we co-create our reality. And that's what came to me as you were saying that, like the brilliance and how, right, like if we can come to creating relationships and community from a place of like excitement and joy and brilliance and connection, I just think it's like it's going to make it way easier for us to be less like fearful about being authentic or upsetting someone or yeah, I guess like we'll find out real quick who is our people or not. But at the same time, I think it's just actually meant to be enjoyable.
And even to be honest, like even on that enjoyable kind of like comment, what I find really interesting on money today is because it is losing value, we're incentivized to consume over save. So we have this environment where we're constantly consuming. And in society, what you start to notice is that people think happiness is from the next thing. It's the Lamborghini, it's the gold watch, it's this, it's that. And happiness is this external thing. When in reality, happiness is very much an internal thing. And Michael Neal in his book talks about this idea that whenever we're going and doing all of these spiritual practices, it's as if we're seeking that wellness. We're forgetting that actually that wellness is inside of us at all times. We don't have to travel to India and hike up into the mountains and do a 20-day Vipassana meditation to be able to find that balance and find that inner wellness and that peace. That peace is along with us at any moment. And I think that's connecting it back to like the connection between money, fiat, and spirituality and wellness, I think is profound.
This is my favorite conversation ever. Like these are all the things I like to talk about in one. Like, oh my gosh. And, it actually changed my whole life, like spending time with Michael Neal over the years and like other 3P authors and coaches. But really, because what I learned is like at the worst time in my life, I was the happiest. Like there, like all of the conditions should have made me really feel horrible. And it's not that I never felt a negative emotion because I actually think negative emotions aren't negative. They're just emotions that don't feel as good as good as like other emotions. But that's what I learned. I learned to just like understand that the experience that I was having, like I didn't, but it's not like it's like kind of if you can describe the three principles, you don't really understand them. It's not like I can just say, here's exactly the formula, but that's what's so beautiful about it because it's more like insights come and help you to continually see how life is good. Life is constantly supporting your connection and your opportunity and your possibilities and your everything. Like it's just that in those moments of when we are stuck in our thinking or things are hard, things are just hard. Like I get lonely or I feel like I'm missing like connection or people in my life or feel isolated, but it's in knowing that that's not happening because like you're doing something wrong or something is wrong with you. And I think that's one of my favorite values of the three principles, which is just like you're not broken and like you're not experiencing pain because like you did something wrong. Like, yeah, there might be something for you to see in that pain, and your body might be giving you pain so that you can listen to it, so you can change some things that you're doing to feel better. But the real value of, self contentment is that there's nothing outside of ourselves that actually can change the way that we feel.
And I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that, you said it so perfectly. And what really comes to mind is, like, I went down the rabbit hole of nearly becoming a somatic practitioner, somatic therapist. And one of the things they talk about in somatic therapy is that there are no positive or negative emotions. An emotion is simply an emotion. It's giving us information about the world around us. And I look at it the same as these experiences we have out there in the world. There's no positive or negative experiences. There's simply some are more comforting, some are more discomforting. And many times we need those discomforting emotions to recognize what are the positive ones. You need, again, relationships. You need polarity. And so you need that discomfort and comfort. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, I was reading this book many years ago, and don't quote me on this, but it said something along the lines of, during periods of like war or mass austerity, like what you would deem in society as major periods of suffering, there's almost zero depression. And a lot of what you would see today is like these negative mental well-being states, which is really interesting. It's like, why is that taking place? And it's because our focus is we're not stuck in our heads. We're focused on the task at hand. Whereas today, when we're trying to make life as comfortable as possible, people are just so lost. People don't know what they're doing, and highest rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, you name it. And all of that drops off when people are put into severe suffering. And I find that really interesting.
Yeah, same. I love that. I think that there's a lot of value in just understanding the duality of emotions and the duality even of life. Like, because they can get so extreme, like we've got to get rid of this, or fiat has to get gone. But like, if we didn't have fiat, we wouldn't have Bitcoin, like it's like the duality. If we didn't have sadness and grief, we wouldn't have joy. And I love the duality. I mean, I could talk all day. This is so many things that I love to talk about. I'm so excited that you entered into the world of Michael Neal.
Well, and you know what? It's, again, one of those moments where the world gives you what it is you need to grow. I saw a comment on Twitter. Someone said, this book has completely changed my life from this one idea. And I was just like, wow, that is a profound statement to say on a book. Like, there's not many books that I think change your trajectory or that your outlook on the world drastically. And that's one of those books. So anyway, I was like, oh, well, I'll add it to my reading list. And so I bought the book. I bought an ebook version and I add it to my kind of reading list. And then a few months later, I'd just totally forgotten about it. A few months later, I'm going on a dog walk and I'm like, oh man, I need something to listen to. And I was like, what is this book? I have no idea I'd completely forgotten about why it was there. And on this walk, I just decided to listen to it. And within 3 pages, I was just like, this is profound. Like, this is an absolutely profound book. I immediately went and ordered the physical copy. I was like, it does not deserve listening to it. I need to sit down and read this. So the physical copy is actually right behind me on the chest of drawers over there.
Mine is too, actually.
And then as I'm reading it, he also mentions a few other books, the relationship book that you were mentioning. And he also mentions a book called The Enlightened Gardener. And The Enlightened Gardener, I actually ended up finishing before I finished this book because I was just like, I want to read how did this come about? How did this guy find himself writing this book? And so The Enlightened Gardener is also a really interesting book as well.
That's what I did actually too. I found the Inside Out Revolution, but then I actually listened to The Enlightened Gardener and some other Sid Big stuff. And actually, for everybody watching, I'll put a book list in the show notes because these are some primo books. Really, I'll put like the book that I wrote that first chapter into for practitioners about. It's basically the 6 keys to holding transformational space, but it's really just this understanding of how to show up for people to just let their perfection come out. So this has been fabulous. I'll also put your links in the show notes and your book and everything like that. And I'm just so thankful for you coming on and filming this episode with me.
Oh, honestly, I really appreciate just the energy and the content you put out in the space. And I'm really excited to hang out in person at whatever the next event is that we're going to be able to see each other. And kind of on your note about the book, a lot of these topics, not necessarily the spiritual or relationship stuff, but on the impact of money on society, I have The Hidden Cost of Money, which is a book that I wrote. And I never want money to be a barrier to learning. And so if someone is listening and they're like, man, I'd love to learn about this, but I'm not in the financial position to do so, feel free to just reach out on Twitter at Sub Bunney, Bunney, or on my website, subbunny.com. And I'm more than happy to send you the ebook for free. Because in the end, I think that we should be able to share this knowledge, and that's how we grow as a community.
Agreed. I'll share those links in the show notes too. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Heather.